and welcome to Modern Business. I'm your host, Mark Barrerio. Today we are talking to Dennis Barkis, who owns the Lure restaurant. How are you today, Dennis?
Fine.
So what type of restaurant is the Lure?
Well, Mark, this is basically a fast food type restaurant, just like a McDonald's.
And where is it located?
This was located in eastern part of Gary.
That's the Miller section, I believe.
Correct.
Okay, how did you first come about to owning the Lure restaurant?
I had worked there for a number of years, part-time, and I learned more and more as I gained experience. And for a year prior to my owning it, I had been a manager there full-time. And the owner got to a point in his life where he wanted to retire and bow out and go to the Southwest and relax. And I had worked there with Virginia, who's my partner, an older woman, and he approached us and asked us, would we like to take over the ownership and run it ourselves? And that's basically how I got to the point where I owned it.
Okay. So then you were a manager before you became an owner?
Right.
Okay. What was involved in making your decision to own it? Did you know enough financially that it would be secure, that you would make a profit?
Well, any type of big decision like that, you really don't know, what the future will bring, just like you can't predict the weather. But I really hadn't thought about it, and it really wasn't my goal in life, but it seemed like a challenge. So my partner was, as soon as she heard about it, she wanted to go into it right away. I was a little less enthusiastic, but as
Why
time
were
went,
you less enthusiastic about it?
because, like I said, I hadn't really thought about it. It wasn't really my first love in life. You really have to have a love for the restaurant business to want to own one. But as I thought about it, I thought, well, maybe I could learn more about it, and maybe if I really do it, I'll find something that I really want to stick with it. So I finally made the decision to go down to the lawyer's office and sign the papers. And
Okay, so when you first became the owner and you came back to work the next day or whatever, after you took care of the business matter, how did the employees treat you?
there was a little bit of a difference.
In what way?
They sort of had, I guess maybe they thought I was going to come in and be a completely different person or something like that. Well, look at him now, he's the owner now. And I felt a little bit different too, but it's not really a big deal.
So were they intimidated when you first came in?
Not when
To
I
what
first came
degree?
in, no. Not when I first came in.
Okay. When you first came in as the owner, did you change rules around, or did you change
Yeah.
the way it was run?
Yes, I did. Our previous boss had been known to be pretty strict, and they thought when I took over it was going to be a little more of a party, but they were really surprised when I started making even stricter rules. Then,
So when you were a manager, then you were more like a common worker, you were friends, you worked along with the employees.
I had worked night shift almost exclusively, and it's a little more relaxed at night, and you joke around with people, and you tend to make friends with them, sure. Plus, the workers are pretty young there, too, and I was pretty young. So, we have a lot in common. And also, when you're a manager, you don't, you're watching somebody else's business. It's not your own. So you tend to be a little more friendlier with the employees than if you were really a top-flight professional.
So when you finally owned the Lure, things had definitely changed.
Right.
Because now it was yours and not someone else's.
Yeah.
What are the difference or similarity between being a manager and being an owner?
Well, it's like they say, friendship and business don't mix. That's very true. When I became the owner, I found it was tougher to have friendships, and when I did make stricter rules, some people got offended, and they really couldn't understand what I was doing. They thought perhaps it was going to be a little more lenient. They're a little bit of a party, but I felt the responsibility on my shoulders then after I signed the papers. So there was the buck stopped with me. So I felt everything there was mine. I had to be responsible for it. So I was a little tougher on them.
So what about your duties? When you're a manager, you have certain duties, and now when you're owner, you have more duties.
Okay. Now, when I became the owner, I was involved more in the business decisions, accounting, legal, more into the ordering of things and more involved with the hiring of people. Because at night, you don't really get involved with those things too much. But as I took over this role, you had more of,
Okay, now you were the night manager. Now I know most of the duties of ordering these supplies were done in the daytime. How did you know what to order, how much to order for your supplies?
Well, you gauge from how much you sell during the week, how much things you're going to need. And plus, some of the suppliers they had been there they'd serviced the lure for a long time, and so they have a pretty close relationship with you, and they help you along. They're happy to teach you because they want to continue to have business with you. So they're helpful.
So I imagine you made a lot of mistakes at the beginning, or was it since the suppliers helped you, there was no mistakes?
Oh, no, not in that, no.
Did you make short supplies where you just didn't order enough?
Yeah, I've done that, but I think just everybody in that position
Just
does
trial
that.
and error.
Yeah.
Very good. So, being of a service-oriented business, okay, how did you have to deal with the public? Because, they bring in the money to buy your goods.
Yeah, right. Well, how do we deal with the public? We try to do the best way we can, You do get a lot of, how could I put it?
Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to break for a commercial here. We'll get right back to that topic. This is Modern Business, and we're talking to Dennis Barkis, who owns the Lure Restaurant. And we're right back after these brief messages. Back to Modern Business. We're talking to Dennis Barkis. Okay, I asked a question before the break about dealing with the public. I want to rephrase this now. I know the golden rule is that the customer is always right. Do you find that the case?
Well, not in 100% of the time. You try to be very, friendly and polite to them, but we had a lot of people, because of the area, because there was a lot of bars around there, we had a lot of people coming in that had slightly overindulged in alcohol, and they would come in making inebriated requests.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is really, there's a limit to the customer being always right. You can't do absolutely everything they want.
When you have the irate customer that comes in, a little on the drunk side, and orders food, so what do they basically do? They order something and they change their minds, or?
Well, they may do that, or they may be very rude to the waitresses, the girls working there.
So how do you handle that as a owner, manager? Now, how do you handle those people? Do you just throw them out? Do you try to be polite? Do you just give in to what they want?
No, you can't. You can't give in to what they want. You have to. If they're just being overtly ridiculous, you just have to draw the line and say, I'm sorry. Please take your business elsewhere. We had a lot of problems like that, and plus with a lot of other types of crime there, and eventually we had to get a security force there because it got pretty wild and woolly, especially on hot summer nights.
Okay, now I know that you said that you're located in Gary.
Right.
That's noted for its high crime rate.
Yes.
So, did you have a lot of problems with crime?
We had numerous break-ins there. We had a few robberies there.
Well, tell us about some of those experiences.
Well, the first time I was robbed, this is before we had our security force, and this is when I was the manager, before I had become owner. And I had told the owner, I says, it's getting sort of crazy around here. You should get some kind of security force here. And he says, well, no, you're exaggerating. So sure.
Now, the owner at that time wasn't there all the time, right?
No, he'd come in a couple hours during the daytime. And,
Okay.
you didn't really know what was going on. Especially at night, it gets a little wilder.
Right.
Sort of like the Wild West. But this particular time, the first time I had gotten robbed, I was scared to death. What had happened was one of the girls that worked there was in on it, and after we closed, she went to the back door and unlocked it while I had all this money out on the desk, our day's receipts. And these three fellows came in there, and this one guy is holding his gun, and I was scared to death because I didn't.
Naturally.
Yeah, right. I didn't know what was going to happen, and for some reason, I don't know, they put me in the cooler. There's all these other people standing around. They're not doing anything to them, but they took me and put me in the cooler. Maybe they thought I was going to, I don't know, hit him or something. I don't know. Anyway, I was scared to death, and they took the money and ran. And what happened was they were caught the next day, and they spent almost all the money, and they found out what the whole thing, what that happened was, and some people were fired, and a couple of these guys eventually had to go to a boys' school or whatever they call it for underage offenders, and that was the first time. Now, we had a couple other incidents like that later on, but never as scary as that one.
That was the worst one.
Right.
So you were robbed more than once.
Yeah, about 3 or 4 times.
When the second time happened and the third time, did you react better? Were you less afraid?
Yeah, I was less afraid because I felt really all they were there for was money. And I didn't really feel in any particular danger. As long as we just gave them what they wanted, you know, I would just go along with their requests and they would leave. And that's really what they wanted, was the money. And I felt a little calmer because I felt secure that's all they wanted. Although there's always a little element of danger and you don't know what's going to happen.
So that they have never shot anybody?
No, fortunately, no. Nobody's ever been hurt
That's
there.
good.
And I guess we've been pretty fortunate in that respect because there's been a lot of injuries in that area, result of criminal activity.
Okay, you're also located in Gary. Now, we all know that the steel mills has been down and the layoffs has been high. How does that affect your business?
Very adversely. We got most of our business because from workers at U.S. Steel and also their families. When times were good, they'd come in there and, you know, buy all the goodies we had there. But as the mills laid off, naturally these people had less to spend, and so our business dropped off. Especially a lot of the big orders. We used to get like $50 orders for, you know, guys working at the mills to get food for their breaks.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. I would love to keep on talking all afternoon, but we are on a time schedule. I would like to thank you for joining us on Modern Business, and we hope that you will join us next week, in which our guest will be Lee Iacocca. Thank you so much for joining me, and have yourself a really great day.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Travel Edition. I'm Nancy Jurek, your hostess, and my guest today is Mr. Bernie Charlotte, a psychology and social studies teacher at George Rogers Clark High School in Hammond. Hello, Mr. Charlotte. I'm glad you could join us today.
Well, Nancy, I'm very glad that you invited me. This is a rare occasion for me to talk about a trip like the one I just finished last year, and I'm very happy to be here.
I understand that you were among a group of teachers that went to the Soviet Union last February. Why did you decide to go to the Soviet Union?
Well, I felt as a social studies teacher, I needed a little more depth in my teaching and not just a textbook approach. I thought since I teach about the Soviet Union, I should have a little first-hand knowledge about the nation myself.
And you felt that you could teach your students better if you were there yourself?
I think so. Although my trip was only 10 days, I think it gave me a little bit more of a feel for the nation and the people.
During your 10-day stay, what cities did you visit?
The two largest cities, Moscow and Leningrad.
And out of Moscow and Leningrad, which city did you enjoy the most and why?
Well, Moscow reminded me of any big American city. People cold, rush around. You could fall down on the street and they'd probably walk over you, just like New York or Chicago. Leningrad was much more laid back, very friendly, very much, I would say, like a San Francisco.
What did you have to do before entering or leaving the country? Search your bags, visa, passport, things of that nature?
Well, very, very exact, Nancy. The instructions we had to follow, our passport, the visa, exactly how many pictures they wanted for our visa, how large for our visa. The passport was minor, but it was the visa that was very important. You know, and the funny thing, Nancy, about the Soviet Union, if you looked at my passport, every country I've ever been to, they stamp the entry and stamp when you're leaving. The Soviet Union, for some reason, I don't know if it's just with Americans, they did not stamp my passport that I entered, and they did not stamp my passport that I left.
No. I understand you visited a number of schools. How many schools did you visit?
Well, we, I think 3 high schools, 2 elementary schools in Moscow, 3 high schools, 1 elementary school, and the highlight of the trip, I think, was the University of Leningrad.
Could you compare a Soviet elementary school to an American elementary school? What are the similarities and the differences between the two schools?
Well, I think there's a lot of similarities. I think the teaching methods are very similar. I think the enthusiasm of the youngsters. I think the way the teachers relate to the youngsters at this particular stage. You can see that the teachers love the children. In those ways, I think very similar. The only major difference that I saw was the amount of work that was expected of the students, and it was a little more structured than you would find in, say, a good American elementary school.
How long do they go to school? Like our elementary schools mainly go from 8:30 to 2:30, around that time. How long do they go?
I think it would be similar, and once they get past grade 5, they attend a half a day on Saturday, and that's true of the high schools also.
What are high schools like?
And again, their high schools are in many ways like ours, with a major difference that once they have English-speaking high schools, Spanish-speaking high schools, Arabic-speaking high schools, Chinese-speaking high schools. And once you decide to go to one of those high schools, you concentrate in that area of foreign language. And by the time you're about 16 or 17, if you have gone to an English-speaking high school or a Chinese-speaking high school, by the time you're in your last year of high school, you're extremely fluent in that language, and you probably receive 12 hours of instruction in that language a week.
So language is really stressed highly in that country.
A foreign language. Then they have specific high schools where the emphasis is on, say, mathematics or science. And there are even some high schools where the emphasis, believe it or not, is on athletics. But you get all the same, you get the subjects, but the concentration, like at the English-speaking high school, would be in English.
How are their universities? I understand that only a select few get to attend college in the Soviet Union. What is the atmosphere like?
I think that is where the big difference is in their educational system. Very drab, everything very businesslike. The relationship between students and professors, very formalized. Nothing like at an American university where you see the give and take of students. Nothing that can even approach that. I would say that's the biggest difference I saw. Now, again, I have to be careful, Nancy. After 10 days and seeing one university, you know, I'm not trying to pass myself off as an expert.
Well, excuse me, we have to take a commercial break right now, but we'll be back following these announcements. Please stay tuned. Back to the travel edition. I'm Nancy Jurek, your hostess, and my guest is Mr. Bernie Charlotte. During the first half of the show, we were talking about the school systems in the Soviet Union. Now I'd like to concentrate more on the Soviet people themselves and the society. Mr. Charlotte, tell us about Soviet society. What are the problems that you see in the society as compared to like our American society?
Well, you want to ask me about some of the negative aspects, and I think some of the one negative aspect I saw, I think, is the high rate of alcoholism.
Like in our country, how the negative aspects of our society are highly publicized, such as the divorce rate and right now AIDS. Is alcoholism highly publicized? Are many people aware of it?
Oh, I think so, Nancy. In fact, Pravda, Vetsia, the two major newspapers, television, very much aware of the problem, constantly talking about the problem and possible solutions and educational policies, and I think I don't think they're trying to hide it. I think it really is a problem in that country.
You mentioned to me earlier about your wife having an experience with alcoholism in the Soviet Union. Could you tell us about that?
Well, I think when my wife was in the Russian city of Kiev, there were 6 people waiting for a bus, and a truck driver who was intoxicated ran up and killed 3 or 4 of them while they were waiting for the bus. And my wife said she heard on the news the next day that the driver had been executed.
No trial, no nothing. It was
just
right away, huh?
And you know, it's amazing. You see all ages. You see women who are intoxicated, younger people like your age, university students. I think it's a problem that cuts across all ages and probably all professional groups in the
Wasn't there a
Soviet Union.
drinking age there? A legal drinking
Yeah,
age?
there is a legal drinking age, and I think it's 21. But just like anything else, Nancy, just like in our country, I suppose if somebody wants it, you know, they can get it.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a problem. I think, I don't know if you would call this a social problem, but I think a big problem is I think the people are just darn bored. Boredom, I think, with what they can do in their leisure time. And I don't think there's a great many things they can do. I know the Soviet Union always talks about the Bolshoi theater and many of the fine cultural things, but I think the average common Russian, I think he's very bored with his life.
There's not many things to do for enjoyment then over there.
There's a great many athletic events. I think in Moscow alone, I think there's over 37 stadiums in Moscow in sporting events. But I don't think they have anything that approaches the kind of entertainment, the kind of leisure activities that we have in our country.
Mr. Charlotte, you often hear of Americans not being very welcomed in foreign countries. France is a good example of that. I've heard very negative things. I guess the French are not very fond of Americans. How did the Soviets treat you?
I would say, with the exception of coming into the country, which was a horrible experience, the passport and going through customs. That was a horrible experience. I think after that, I think the experience was what I would call very positive. I don't know, I think I may have mentioned to you the first day I arrived at Leningrad, and the gentleman who helped me with my baggage, who saw the Newsweek magazine in my handbag, and said he would like to purchase it, and I said, no, you take it. A couple hours later, he knocked on my door, and he invited me over to his apartment for dinner to meet his wife and his daughter. And I would say, Nancy, something as simple as that was maybe to come in contact and actually see how a Russian family lives. To me, that was one of the highlights of the trip.
That must have been the
Really,
best experience you had then.
Right, I think so.
Would you like to return to the Soviet Union in the future? Why or why not?
Oh, I'd like to go back. And I think my experience was so limited, just For example, if someone just came and saw New York and Chicago or New York or Los Angeles, I don't really think you come away with a real feeling. I'd like to get into some of the smaller cities out in the countryside. That's the kind of thing I'd like to do the next time I have the opportunity. I'd very much like to return.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're out of time for today. I'd like to thank Mr. Charlotte for being our guest. Thank you, Mr. Charlotte.
Oh, thank you, Nancy, for having me.
That concludes this week's segment of the Travel Edition. I'm Nancy Jurek. Thank you for watching.
Good afternoon, and welcome to another segment of 15 Minutes. I'm your host, Ann Melby, and today my guest is John Montine, a 1984 Purdue graduate with a BA in Bachelor Arts Science. Welcome, John. So how are you?
Very good, Ann. Nice to be here.
Presently, you're employed at the South Lake Mental Health Center. What exactly is your position with them?
For the past year, I have been a crisis intervention specialist with the forensic unit. And the forensic unit operates in Lake County Jail. Actually, South Lake Center for Mental Health has a contract to provide mental health service for the inmates. This is the result of a lawsuit that took place several years ago that was brought on behalf of Project Justice and Equality. As a result of that lawsuit, many more services are made available to the inmate population, because as you know, in our system, you're innocent until proven guilty, and a lot of the people there don't have enough money for a bond, they don't have enough money to get a private lawyer, so some of them are there for several months, and during that time they're in need of all physical services as well as mental health services.
So you deal with the inmates at Lake County Jail then?
Yes. We provide several services. We provide suicide evaluation quite often. People come in who are inebriated, intoxicated. It may be their first time that they've ever been arrested. And
do you find a lot of your the inmates there are arrested, or they're there for one reason or another due to either alcohol or drugs?
Oh yes, it really is a common denominator. Our data shows that at least 80% of the clientele at the jail, at least that we come in contact with, have a substance abuse problem. There's no way of telling whether, and it's certainly aggravated by that problem, there's no way of telling that they did the crime if they're guilty because of that problem.
Just to go back for a minute, I understand that you were selected the Outstanding Senior at Purdue Calumet in 1984. Tell me, along with that and your other experiences through Purdue, how did you land a terrific job at Lake County Jail? I mean, jobs in psychology are not easy to come by.
Well, the #1 major across the country is psychology. It's very useful for going on to law or several different majors, graduate schools. As you say, quite rightly, it is difficult to get a job with just a bachelor's degree. In that respect, Purdue was very helpful. I had the good fortune of working at Tri-City Mental Health during my last semester of my senior year, doing a practicum there in crisis intervention. And through the graces of Joyce McLaren, who's just happens to be a doctoral intern at South Lake with us now, I was able to go out on calls with her to process emergency commitment papers on people And it was a very good resume builder and very good practical experience.
Well, sure, and helped you get your foot in the door.
Absolutely.
No doubt about it.
Yes.
Well, tell me, what are your primary responsibilities?
Well, as I said, we primarily deal with suicide evaluation. We also help the classification officer provide the right mix. Occasionally, an inmate will come in perhaps with a psychiatric history, perhaps he's been hospitalized before, perhaps he's on psychotropic medications, and the medical department has to be made aware of that. The classification officer has to be made aware of that. So quite often an inmate will get himself tangled up with other more hardened inmates at the jail and get hurt.
Do you personally, when you're dealing with, do you deal with the inmates on a one-to-one basis or more with group therapy?
We do have some groups. Primarily what I do is one-on-one types of things. We have various levels of security that we have available to us, ranging from private tete-a-tete in the privacy of my office to a separate, it amounts to a cage in the hallway, to seeing them behind the bars, depending on if they're very intoxicated, if they're acting out, if they're very belligerent. It's not unusual to have someone come in who's high on PCP, cocaine, heroin, or a combination of these.
Have you ever been in the situation where you felt you were in a life and death situation?
Yes, when
where
I first started there, I made the worst mistake I've done in a year. I took an inmate who was on an emergency commitment into a private room, and he began to act out and was jumping up and down and screaming and literally frothing at the mouth. And I just was able at that time to maintain my cool until finally an officer came, which is about 20 minutes later, and I asked them later, why didn't you come sooner? Because they're supposed to make regular checks. And it turned out that they'd heard the commotion, but they thought it was another inmate who was also acting out that day. So it was pretty much play it by ear.
Like,
but I learned my lesson. Now I'm much more selective who I see.
You really
in
want to go
private.
back tomorrow, I bet.
Yeah.
What have I gotten
Yeah,
myself
that was
into?
about as scary as it gets, really. But fortunately, we've had a real good record. To date, knock on wood, we haven't had any mental health workers attacked. We've had a lot of attempts at intimidation, but that's pretty much part and parcel of the job. Typically, we're viewed really as a beneficial thing, because a lot of the inmates are ignorant actually of what we do. So therefore they don't know if we're lawyers or doctors, or if maybe we can't go to court to help them out. We don't. We avoid court like the plague, of course. That's not really what we do. But the inmates don't know that. We're really pretty much treated with respect.
You don't, but there are times of hostility, I'm sure.
There are, but typically you can tell that when I go to pull somebody out of a section, I'll watch his eyes. I'll see, does he make eye contact with me? Sometimes you almost literally see smoke coming out of their ear. If that's the case, I'll elect to see them in the hall cage, and I can deal with them just as effectively there.
Do you basically have your meetings in a room, or do you go to the jail cells themselves? Or?
It really depends on the situation. It's not unusual. There are certain areas, cells that are like maximum security, where we see the inmates right in the single cell. However, we have the option of taking them out at any time and moving them to our office.
It's got to be a fascinating thing.
It's very interesting. You meet a wide selection of the population.
I can imagine. Well, we'll be right back with more about your job at South Lake. Right now, we're going to break for a few messages from our commercial sponsors. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm your host, Ann Melby, and my guest today is John Montine. John, we were talking about your role at the jail. Upon your first meeting with the inmates, exactly what are the things you look for?
Well, a lot of my work really gets done before I even meet the inmate. I want to find out as much as I can about that individual before I ever lay eyes on him. I want to find out if there's family members present. I'd like to interview them. I want to interview the arresting officer and certainly the booking officers. Why am I seeing this person? Is he an emergency commitment? Have the courts judged him to be a danger to himself or to someone else? Has he threatened a family member? Has he just possibly killed or harmed a family member? All these are very important before I even see the individual, and it has a lot to do with my determination where I'm going to meet him. Once I find out as much as I can, I'll approach the individual And right away you're looking for signs of gross psychosis, you're looking for signs of drug intoxication. How is he responding to me? If I say hello, does he say butterfly? You know, is he relevant? Is he appropriate? Is he hostile? Is he belligerent? Is he sad? Is he depressed?
You know, your role, you're an intervention crisis specialist, correct? Now, how does that differ from a psychologist or a psychiatrist, limitations that are put on you within
Well, a
the
crisis
job?
intervention specialist is the role that I fulfill, and I can do that with a bachelor's degree in psychology. A psychologist has a doctorate in psychology, either a PsyD degree from a professional school of psychology, or, which is more typical, a PhD from a university. You have to have either of those designations before you can call yourself a psychologist. Now, a psychiatrist is a medical doctor who's gone through 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, and then done 2 years of an internship in psychiatry. A psychiatrist primarily is more concerned with medical issues, with medication evaluations. If we have someone who is grossly psychotic, who is disoriented to time and place, is obviously in distress, quite often that person needs to be medicated.
Right, and there are times where you can, you know, suggest such medication.
We can suggest that. Typically what we do is refer it to the psychiatrist that we have on staff, and he makes that determination because obviously he's a medical doctor, he's qualified. We can spot signs of gross normality, abnormality, and we chart on that, and then we make our findings known to the psychiatrist, but then he does the actual evaluation. One thing I look for too in the beginning interview is a history of psychiatric care. If someone comes in and they've been to Logansport already, they've been to Marion VA Hospital, they're about 30 years old, you can pretty much tell that, hey, they're off their medication. Perhaps they're on lithium for manic depressive episodes, or they're on Thorazine, or any of the heavier psychotropic medication. That's a pretty good indication to what your diagnosis should be, and it's also a very good indication to what your follow-up care should be with that individual.
You know, when you meet with these patients, I'm sure there are times you've heard the old doctor-patient relationship. Is it sometimes difficult to not become emotionally involved or disturbed by the problem?
It is, and because of the nature of our clientele, it can be dangerous in terms of burnout. A lot of our inmates, well, all of them don't want to be there. No one volunteers to go to jail, certainly. So some of them come from quite bad backgrounds. Some of them have had some real serious trauma in their lives. And that can be real depressing. The job does certainly have its rewards. There are times, particularly with suicide evaluation and doing the actual crisis intervention, when we talk to someone who is threatening suicide. And there are some specific things.
How do you deal with that? I mean, someone says, you know, I just don't want to live anymore. What do you say to them?
Typically, when someone has reached that point, we try to examine what their previous coping mechanisms were. Do they have a strong family background? Do they have a strong church affiliation? What is their feelings about their family? Typically, if someone can be carried through that first 24 to 48 hour period, they're going to make it. The one thing about suicide that's rather interesting, what we try to go for in the interview is a verbal no suicide contract. If someone has been threatening suicide or giving us a lot of suicidal ideation, we'll ask them, you know, can you promise me for a certain amount of time, for 24 hours, shall I talk to you again, not to hurt yourself?
Bottom line, if you're dealing with an inmate, who says this person's crazy? Who has the final word?
Well, that isn't really germane, because what does crazy mean? All we can do is try to assess what their needs are at the current time and meet those needs.
Okay. Well, John, I've really enjoyed our talk with you, and it's been very informative.
Thank you. Enjoyed being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for meeting us here on 15 Minutes. I'm Ann Melby, your host, and I hope you'll join us again. Have a nice day.